Welcome. Today, we're plunging into a paradox that has long puzzled me. How is it that a country as technologically dynamic as the United States, birthplace of the World Wide Web, leader in biotech, home to innovators like Bill Gates, how can it feel so utterly stuck, maybe even stagnant politically?
Right. It's a stark contrast.
Exactly. We've seen these incredible advancements, yet our political institutions, like Congress, seem to struggle more than they did a century ago. They grapple with basic reforms, get consumed by hot-button issues.
And can feel really distracted from the country's big needs.
Yeah, it's striking.
It really is.
And this dive into that paradox, it's really built on some fascinating insights from Scott Shane's work. His stuff provides a unique lens on how American democracy has evolved.
Okay.
So we're going to try and connect the dots across different historical eras, explore how the fundamental mechanisms of American politics have, well, dramatically shifted over the last century or so.
So our mission today is basically to unpack these historical dynamics, to really understand how American politics actually functions, not just how we might wish it would.
Got it. So less idealism, more realism.
Exactly. Get ready for maybe some crucial insights about the forces shaping our political landscape.
Okay, so let's dive back into that question. How can a country so dynamic technologically feel so stuck politically? The sources point out it's not just about what Congress isn't doing.
No.
Even when major laws pass, they often end up heavily larded with pork barrel projects.
Yeah, I've seen that.
And even when there were large budget surpluses, money that could fund education, healthcare, Congress seems stuck in this torpor, distracted by issues like abortion or specific military policies that, honestly, for most Americans, aren't the main concerns.
Right. And serious national challenges. They often get debated with just narrow partisanship. Scandals, even petty corruption can just completely overshadow any forward movement.
So how do we start to unravel this?
Well, the source introduces three ways of looking at it. Three complementary, not contradictory, historical perspectives on how American democracy actually operates. Think of them as different lenses.
Okay, three lenses. What's the first one?
First, there's the electoralist view. This is the idea that what government does is, well, primarily determined by who voters elect, which candidates, which party holds power.
Right.
Political parties, in this view, play this vital mediating role, bringing diverse interests together. There's a great quote: "No America without democracy, no democracy without politics, no politics without parties, no parties without compromise and moderation." And this ideal, it worked best when parties were really competitive and lots of people actually voted. High participation.
So that's kind of the familiar story, right? Your vote, your candidate, their party, they determine policy. The basic civics textbook version.
It's definitely where many of us start. But as the 20th century went on, another view became really prominent, the pluralist school of thought.
Okay, pluralist. What's that about?
This view sees organized groups think powerful business lobbies, growing labor unions as the dominant forces shaping government action.
Okay, so interest groups.
Exactly. They saw government policy as the resolution of many different vectors. Each vector is like the force exerted by a big organized group. That was one where all the major groups, including both labor and business, were properly represented. And many people thought America in the 1950s actually came pretty close to that ideal.
Interesting. And the third view?
That's the elite or establishment view. This one suggests that organized groups, often from the upper levels of business, finance, academia, they influence policy too, but not necessarily for narrow self-interest.
Right.
No, but for what they genuinely see as the national interest. Think of figures like Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Stimson. They embodied this tradition of valuing public service above private gain, often driven by a real faith in social science to find impartial solutions. And what's really fascinating here, the real takeaway perhaps, is how these views, which might seem distinct, actually build on each other historically. They give us a much more comprehensive picture. The aha moment is realizing American democracy isn't static, right? It's this historical tapestry woven from all three threads.
With different threads being more dominant at different times.
Precisely. You can't really get a handle on any period of 20th century politics without understanding the roles played by voters and parties and by interest groups and by these elites. The source argues that American democracy really thrived most when voters felt they actually affected government.
Right.
And when groups like labor and consumers, not just business, had significant influence, often with active support from those elites.
Okay. So let's talk about parties first. It's clear they were once central, right?
Absolutely central. The sources explain how they emerged as truly national institutions back in the 1820s. They grew into these powerful local and national organizations that, chose candidates, shaped platforms, raised money.
All the basic functions we still associate with them, but maybe stronger then.
Much stronger, arguably. Elections were often described as being like sporting events, commanding intense loyalty. For decades, parties were maybe the only genuinely important national political institutions. They even funded local newspapers through patronage. And high voter turnout, especially from like 1832 to 1860, really shows how important they were early on.
But that didn't last forever.
No, definitely not. Party power started to decline significantly in the late 19th century. You had civil service reform in 1883, for example. That took a lot of federal jobs out of party control, stripping away a key source of patronage.
So less ability to reward loyalty.
Exactly. And business leaders, they were getting worried about the rise of socialist and populist parties, so they championed new electoral rules, city manager governments, things that made it harder for third parties to really gain traction. And ironically, even the populists and progressives, the reformers, they contributed to this decline too, by advocating for things like initiatives and referendums, which let voters bypass party competition and the direct election of senators. It's a complex interplay.
So as party power faded, what filled that space? And this brings up a big question for you, the listener. Does your individual vote still matter as much if these other forces hold so much sway?
That's the crucial question. Organized interest groups stepped right into that vacuum left by weakening parties.
Like the example of farmers.
Farmers, for instance, they shifted from forming their own political parties in the 1870s to forming powerful national organizations and lobbies by the 1920s.
And this leads to the rise of K Street.
Pretty much. That's the popular term for Washington's lobbying industry. But its rise wasn't, inevitable. It was also spurred by how the American regulatory state developed, specifically the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946. By making regulatory rulings subject to hearings and judicial review, it essentially turned the whole regulatory process into a kind of mini court.
Leading to a need for lawyers.
And lobbyists, a huge proliferation of them. That act fundamentally shifted power away from the actual government administrators and towards this constant contest among interest groups and their lobbyists.
That seems like a really key piece of the puzzle. It explains a lot about the current landscape.
It really does. And this brings us nicely to looking at some distinct eras where these different forces, voters, parties, groups, elites played out and shaped American democracy.
Okay, let's do that. Where should we start?
Let's begin with the Progressive Era, early 1900s. This was a period driven by a direct response to, massive economic inequality and the sheer power of giant corporations.
Like U.S. Steel, which was enormous.
Staggering influence. So you had movements like the Grangers, the Knights of Labor, the Populists fighting back. They saw government as the essential tool to curb these powerful private monopolies.
And this is where democratic pluralism starts to emerge.
Where organized labor and consumers started to actively contest and sometimes even balance out corporate power. You had elite organizations like the National Civic Federation, founded in 1900. Its whole aim was to bring together business, labor, and the public to find a middle ground, something between unchecked corporate power and socialism.
So trying to mediate.
Exactly. Figures like Mark Hanna, a big industrialist, he actually devoted himself to persuading other industrialists to negotiate with unions. These groups often champion policies based on social science, trying to find solutions beyond narrow self-interest.
That idea of the dispassionate arbiter using expertise.
Precisely. They saw themselves that way.
But then things shifted quite dramatically. With the Age of Melon in the 1920s, the source calls it a far less positive time for democracy.
Yeah, it was a big swing back. Business leaders largely reclaimed control. The dominant view became that government was basically a business and should be run strictly on business principles.
I remember reading about that book, The Man Nobody Knows, portraying Jesus as a businessman.
Right. That reflects the cultural mood, a kind of reverence for business acumen. And lobbyists, instead of being seen suspiciously, were sort of rebranded benignly as legislative agents.
So the elite influence faded.
It waned significantly, yes. That ideal of the disinterested public servant was largely pushed aside by the businessman as the new savior, so to speak.
And what happened to public engagement?
Voter turnout dropped sharply. A deep cynicism about government took hold. Lots of Americans felt ineptitude and inadequacy were government's main characteristics. And the economy, while it was growing, Wages for workers really lagged behind salaries and dividends. Unemployment started surprisingly high, partly due to automation. It was really an era where the elite and pluralist ideas were just kind of drowned out by this single business-driven agenda.
Until the Great Depression, of course. That leads us to the New Deal in the 1930s, a seismic shift.
The Depression just completely exposed the flaws of that unchecked capitalism. It showed quite powerfully that policies improving workers' purchasing power could actually benefit the entire economy, not just a select few.
So a rejection of rugged individualism.
A very heated rejection, and a strong embrace of government control over what was seen as uncontrollable economic superpower.
If we connect this to the bigger picture you mentioned earlier.
The New Deal wasn't just about economic recovery, though that was obviously huge. It fundamentally reshaped the role of government in balancing societal power. While the labor movement had this massive revival, think the CIO forming, the rise of sit-down strikes, very powerful. And crucially, elite networks like the ones around Felix Frankfurter, they provided the intellectual backbone for major legislation, the National Industrial Recovery Act, the Social Security Act.
And these were people committed to that idea of disinterestedness.
Many were, yes, committed to public service. The Wagner Act in particular was key. It made government responsible for actively ensuring labor's power could challenge business.
So it wasn't just letting groups exist, but actively empowering the weaker ones.
Exactly. That's the crucial insight. True democratic pluralism, this suggests, isn't just about groups being there. It's about government actively helping to balance the scales, empowering the less advantaged against concentrated economic might.
It showed a strong, active government could be the fulcrum for balancing power, a critical aha moment for American governance. Okay, so moving into the 1950s, what happens then? There's a shift, right, towards the referee theory.
Yes, a subtle but important shift. That Administrative Procedure Act of 1946 we talked about really kicked in. It meant government increasingly acted as a mediator between interests rather than actively promoting specific ones.
And power shifted.
Power really shifted away from the administrators themselves and towards that constant contest among interest groups and their lobbyists. That legacy is still very much with us today.
But elite influence didn't just vanish.
No, not at all. It continued through groups like the Committee for Economic Development, the CED.
And they saw themselves in that tradition.
They did. They defined themselves as aiming to conduct research without regard to special interests of any group. They supported things like Keynesian economics, foreign aid, and they actually opposed efforts to cripple labor unions.
Interesting. So still trying to find that balance.
Right. The Eisenhower years largely affirmed this idea of balance, with the administration mediating between labor and business. And JFK, too, kind of embodied this elite approach, valuing the disinterested application of social science to solve complex problems.
So the 1950s might have been the peak of that pluralist ideal, where major groups shared influence.
It certainly seemed that way to many observers at the time.
But then, boom, the tumultuous 60s, everything changed.
That was a period of massive upheaval and expansion of government scope, moving beyond just economic issues to tackle quality of life concerns.
Like consumer rights.
Kennedy's Consumer Bill of Rights, Ralph Nader's absolutely groundbreaking work on auto safety, huge impact.
And environmental concerns, too.
Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was a landmark, leading eventually to the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. And of course, women's rights took center stage with Betty Friedan, the founding of NOW.
It feels like these movements were tapping into something deeper, a cultural shift.
Absolutely. They were fueled by this profound cultural shift away from the strict Protestant work ethic towards an ethic of the good life. A focus on happiness on earth, consumption, self-fulfillment.
And that wasn't just people deciding to relax more.
No, it was partly driven by changes in capitalism itself. Factories were becoming so productive, they needed greater consumer demand to keep growing. Some businesses even started talking about an industrial democracy, focused on worker freedom outside the job, mainly so they could consume more.
But the 60s also had that counterculture element.
Right, which was both a product and a critique of this new consumer culture. It rejected mass consumerism, sought more meaningful work, explored sexual freedom.
But it got darker later in the decade.
It did. The escalation in Vietnam, riots, assassinations, it led to a darker, more violent period. Some anti-war and Black Power movements adopted what was called revolutionary politics, sometimes leading to, apocalyptic thinking. Paul Goodman criticized this as being unworldly, a poor basis for politics.
So how did the establishment, the elites, respond to all this tumult?
Foundations like the Ford Foundation, especially under George Bundy, actively tried to sort of tame or co-opt these movements by strategically funding the more moderate elements. They supported civil rights groups, and they actually established consumer and environmental public interest law firms. The idea was to channel protest into productive legal avenues.
Trying to manage the change rather than just letting it happen?
Exactly. It shows how traditional elites tried to navigate and shape that massive societal change.
That leads us into a completely different phase, the conservative ascendancy and its aftermath. Starting with the business counteroffensive in the 1970s. What kicked that off?
It really began with an economic downturn in the late 1960s, which got much worse with the 1973 energy crisis. Corporate profit rates were falling, partly due to more global competition.
And businesses felt under pressure from those 60s movements.
They had kind of acquiesced to environmental and consumer movements for a while, but now they really united. They started to demonize figures like Ralph Nader and actively push back against labor, environmentalists, and consumer advocates. It was a real counter-mobilization.
And they built new structures to do this.
Yes, a powerful new political infrastructure. You had the Business Roundtable formed in 1972. This was CEOs of major corporations getting together specifically to influence policy, directly push for lower costs, resist wage increases.
And the think tanks.
Right. New, explicitly ideological think tanks. AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, was older but got revived and newly powerful in the 70s. And the Heritage Foundation was founded in 1973.
And these were different from the earlier elite organizations.
They were largely funded by business and aimed specifically to challenge what they saw as liberal policy research with their own pro-business, anti-regulation narratives. Studies by people like Murray Weidenbaum on regulation costs, though sometimes questioned later, became incredibly influential in shaping public opinion, often pushed through outlets like Reader's Digest.
So less disinterested, more explicitly advocating a particular viewpoint.
Definitely expressions of political and economic interests, as the source puts it, rather than aiming for disinterestedness.
And K Street exploded then, too.
It absolutely exploded.
Yeah.
Businesses hired thousands of lawyers, PR specialists, created this whole new, very well-funded, Gucci-shod lobbying culture, as it was sometimes called.
And that Administrative Procedure Act from '46 played a role here.
A huge role. It had made regulatory agencies highly susceptible to lobbyist pressure. Washington lawyers and lobbyists could wield enormous power. There was a figure, Charles Walker, who really epitomized this new multidimensional strategy, organizing campaigns, raising money, even hiring academics to give his positions a veneer of legitimacy.
How did business manage to coordinate so effectively and reshape the landscape so quickly?
Their unity was key. Facing what they saw as a common threat really brought them together. And the effect was clear pretty quickly, especially during the liberal rout in the Carter years.
Even though Carter was a Democrat and Democrats controlled Congress.
Exactly. Despite that, major liberal legislative goals, things like labor law reform, creating a consumer protection agency, national health insurance, tax reform, they were largely defeated.
And lobbyists weren't just blocking things.
No, they were actively rewriting legislation. Charles Walker, for instance, was pivotal in getting the capital gains tax cut in 1978. The Business Roundtable, which had initially been sort of neutral on labor law reform, eventually came out strongly against it, massively outspending the AFL-CIO. It showed solidarity, as one observer called it, among the business community against labor interests. A powerful, unified front that liberals just couldn't overcome at that time.
Which paved the way for the Reagan era in the 1980s, seen by many as a revolution.
Reagan really delivered on businesses' wishes, generous tax cuts, lobbied for hard by people like Walker. His administration systematically went about weakening regulatory agencies, the EPA, OSHA, the FTC.
And the air traffic controllers strike.
Crushed unions with that action, yes. His administration marked a really sharp shift away from that earlier idea of a balanced government like Eisenhower's. Instead, Reagan portrayed government itself as the enemy of popular democracy.
Government is the problem.
That was the mantra. And it led to a significant rise in public distrust of government intervention.
And you mentioned a shift in public priorities, too, like what people valued.
Yeah, it was dramatic. Surveys of college freshmen back then showed this marked decline in students feeling it was essential to develop a meaningful philosophy of life. Meanwhile, the percentage prioritizing being very well off financially just surged.
So a shift towards materialism.
It seemed that way. Pop psychology, self-absorption kind of seemed to replace that earlier communal activism of the 60s.
It's striking how you said even the older elite institutions kind of failed to push back against this. You said they were pressured.
That's right. It's like the very institutions meant to provide objective analysis, maybe act as a counterweight, were intimidated. That's a huge shift, wouldn't you say? Older elite organizations, even individuals like Henry Kissinger, didn't really provide a strong counter to this rising tide of corporate individualism. Sometimes they even reinforced it. And these new conservative foundations, they actively attacked the older institutions like the Ford Foundation or the New York Times.
How did they attack them?
By accusing them of liberal bias, by threatening funding, by putting public pressure on them. Eventually, its leadership changed and it abandoned those programs. They were forced to accommodate critics or risk losing credibility and support.
That's a really chilling effect on institutions meant for objective analysis.
It really is. But this conservative dominance, it didn't last forever either. Things started to fray, leading to the conservative crack-up in the late 80s, early 90s.
What caused the crack-up?
Well, partly the threat that had united business, those progressive movements, seemed to dissipate. So business unity started to erode. They began disagreeing over things like trade deficits, healthcare costs, budget deficits.
So self-interest reasserted itself.
You could say that. Some business leaders, like John Young from Hewlett-Packard, even started advocating for government industrial policy to make U.S. firms more competitive globally. That was a big departure from conservative orthodoxy.
And the conservative movement itself started splitting.
Big time. Factionalism emerged. The Christian right wanted more direct political power. You had paleo-conservatives like Pat Buchanan reviving an America First isolationism, which clashed strongly with the neoconservatives who were more focused on promoting democracy abroad.
Different visions of conservatism.
Yeah, very different. Paleos emphasized borders, tradition. Neocons were more interventionist internationally. And all this internal discord combined with a growing public disgust that special interests were running government.
That fueled Ross Perot.
Absolutely. It fueled his strong third-party run in 1992. Polls showed something like 75% of Americans believed government is pretty much run by a few big interests. That was up from just 29% back in 1964.
Wow, that's a huge jump in cynicism.
Huge. And people increasingly wanted government to actually do more to solve our country's problems.
So this public frustration really set the stage for change. Leading into the Clinton years in the 1990s, he came in wanting to re-engage government.
He tried to find a third way, adopting an agenda from groups like the Democratic Leadership Council, DLC, and post-New Left intellectuals, focused on positive nationalism, worker skills, competitiveness, and, significantly, national health insurance.
And he assembled a team to do this.
Yeah, a diverse team, academics, lawyers, businessmen aiming to use social science again to solve national problems, maybe create structures to check corporate power, sort of echoing earlier eras in a way.
But the healthcare reform effort famously failed.
It did. It was ultimately killed off.
By whom?
By a revived K Street and conservative alliance. Small businesses, health insurance companies, and a pretty unified business community actively opposed it. Conservative operatives like Grover Norquist were very skilled at orchestrating attacks, linking the Whitewater scandals to healthcare to distract the administration and rally opposition.
So the same forces that rose in the 70s were still powerful.
Extremely powerful. Clinton basically shifted away from those kinds of ambitious reforms. It proved that the business conservative alliance remained a potent veto force in Washington.
And you mentioned the media change, too.
Yeah, that's another significant piece. The source talks about the wall of separation, the traditional barrier between the news editorial side and the advertising business side of major publications really crumbling.
At places like the New York Times and Washington Post.
Publishers increasingly saw themselves more as just businessmen prioritizing profits, which you can argue made it harder for the media to objectively mediate conflicts or hold power accountable in the same way.
Like tying editor bonuses to profits.
Exactly. The publisher of the LA Times, a former General Mills executive, apparently did that. It really illustrates that shift in priorities.
The channels meant to inform us, hold power accountable, were themselves becoming more influenced by commercial interests.
It adds another layer of complexity. And this whole historical sweep, when you look back at it, reveals this clear pattern, doesn't it?
Hey, what pattern is that?
Periods of massive industrial change, technological innovation. They seem to be typically followed by periods of political and social reform. Economic changes create social conditions that clash with democratic ideals, then that demands a response.
So the aha is that history isn't just straight line.
Right. It's this constant negotiation between power, protest, and the evolving role of government, back and forth.
And what's striking today, the source notes, is that unlike previous eras where resources might have been scarce, the U.S. now have, or at least has had, immense resources. Budget surpluses, for example, resources that could address long-standing problems like healthcare, education, infrastructure.
Yet reform has largely stalled.
Why? The source suggests it's because our political system, which was maybe supposed to have been purged of corruption in the 60s and 70s, is now increasingly driven by big money.
That's the argument. So the final question becomes, what does it take? What's needed for a genuine new era of reform to actually be possible?
Based on history.
Yes. The source points to several crucial conditions drawing on past successes. First, you need countervailing power. American democracy works best when ordinary citizens, workers, consumers can mobilize and exert real power against business interests who naturally have advantages because of their wealth and economic leverage.
So a mobilized citizenry, not just relying on K Street lobbyists, maybe campaign finance reform.
That could be part of it. Something to limit wealth's disproportionate role. Your vote, your voice, needs to stand on more equal footing.
Makes sense.
What else? Second, effective elites and elite organizations. We need to somehow reestablish elites who are genuinely committed to disinterested public service and the national interest, separate from narrow class or party loyalties.
And trust in their expertise matters.
Absolutely. Public trust and expertise is vital for trust in government itself. People need to be able to rely on dispassionate experts for complex decisions.
Okay. Third.
Reclaiming the national government's role, not just as a referee between groups, but as an active instrument of reform, a bulwark against concentrated private power. We need to reject those easy anti-government answers.
Got it. Fourth.
A kind of new millennialism. A revival of a sense of national mission, maybe focused on domestic equality, maybe global democracy, something that moves beyond just self-absorption or narrow moral argument.
A bigger purpose.
And finally, a full acceptance of the quality of life and the pursuit of happiness as legitimate goals for government action. Understanding that social programs don't just enhance quality of life, they can actually sustain capitalism by creating demand. They don't necessarily undermine it.
Recognizing that cultural shift towards happiness on Earth.
Exactly. And integrating that into public policy, the culture shifted away from just the strict Protestant work ethic, and policy needs to reflect that reality.
So the historical record suggests reforms like the Progressive Era and New Deal didn't actually destroy capitalism.
No, the argument is they preserved it, humanized it, democratized it. The challenge for today, then, is how to reconcile our democratic ideals with the realities of a very different world economy, multinational corporations, fierce global competition.
So as we wrap up, and looking out at this new century, given all these historical cycles we've just talked through, what personal or collective action does this inspire in you to maybe bridge that gap between our democratic ideals and the often messy realities of our political system?
That's the question to ponder.